Formula One started its season more than a month ago, in which only 3 races have taken place: the Australian Grand Prix, the Chinese Grand Prix, and the Japanese Grand Prix, and the result is that this 2026 Formula One is a disaster. The top category of motorsport has found itself in a situation where both the drivers harshly criticize these regulations and the fans have shown their enormous disdain through social media for the drastic change we've had this season. And among the biggest criticisms of the current Formula One regulations is that the engine section is a failure that depends heavily on management. The battery, the cars can't be pushed to the limit, but especially, these regulations are potentially dangerous in certain circumstances. Formula One in 2026 has turned into a management formula, following most of the criticism from drivers, the media and fans, which has made Formula One have to react. In this improvised break, due to the lack of races in Bahrain and Jeddah, they're trying to patch up what has been a rather problematic and chaotic start to the top category of motorsport. But how did we get to this point? Why is this technical regulation failing just 3 races into the start of the championship? And what are the proposed solutions to fix this disastrous start to the season? Well, in this video we're going to try to explain how we got to this point, the current crisis that Formula One is experiencing, and above all, what solutions have been proposed to fix this starting from the Miami Grand Prix in 2026. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the analysis of the disaster of the 2026 Technical Regulations 1. As always, and as is tradition, I love to give some background on why we got to this point, and the context of this story is as follows. To understand it, we have to go back to the end of 2022, because before that, Formula One was in its 8th season of the hybrid engine technical regulations that debuted in 2014. However, these technical regulations were always criticized for producing complex and expensive power units, and some of their components were technologies that couldn't even be applied to their production vehicles. The most criticized was the motor generator unit, heat, which was the system that recovered energy through the engine gases and was part of the hybrid system of these power units. This regulation's complexity didn't attract new manufacturers, and Formula One almost lost Honda in 2020 when it announced its withdrawal as an engine supplier. Since these power units were moving away from the brand's goal of shifting its economic and technical resources toward the pursuit of electric vehicle technologies for the future. The Volkswagen Group also wanted to enter the top category using its subsidiaries Porsche and Audi. But the only way they were going to enter the category was if these power units made the electric part of them even more relevant, so they could apply it to their street cars. So, in an attempt to give manufacturers the technology they were asking for, and with that attract new brands and avoid losing the existing ones, a new technical regulation was proposed for the year 2026 where the electric components would have much greater relevance than they've ever had in the category. Since the power levels were going to change from a split of 80% combustion and 20% electric to a 50-50 distribution. This made both Audi enter the category and also led Honda to reverse its decision to leave Formula One. But from the very conception of the regulations, the teams and drivers, based on the simulations they were running in their factories, had commented that these technical regulations had very serious problems even as early as 2023. The drivers announced that on circuits with long straights, they had to resort to aggressive tactics to control energy deployment. And that on circuits with long straights, the energy would run out and they would be left without power halfway down them. However, both Formula One and the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile ignored these initial warnings from the drivers and teams and continued like this until the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025. The Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, perhaps seeing what was about to happen, tried to come up with some solutions to avoid these problems, even going so far as to propose the idea of changing the energy distribution to not rely so much on electricity. However, changes like this, when the regulations are already established, require the majority approval of the Formula One teams, which obviously did not happen, and therefore no changes were made. And with these power units, Formula One headed into the 2026 season, and once there, disaster struck. As many teams had already warned, extreme tactics had to be used to conserve energy because the battery, quite simply, didn't last. This led to the phenomenon of superclipping. That is, the cars had to downshift and rev the engine on the straight to use the motor generator unit, kinetic in reverse, and with that, try to charge the batteries. In addition, the speed differentials that occurred in the single-seaters due to the points where one driver charges energy and the other spends it created a dangerous situation that only took 3 races to fully explode with the accident of Oliver Burman at the Japanese Grand Prix. But the biggest criticisms of these regulations come from the artificiality of the show, more precisely because of the use of such extreme tactics to save energy at key moments, such as during qualifying. So we have a technical regulation that is potentially dangerous, and that becomes too much management at critical moments. So, understanding this, the concept and the context before the birth of these power units, let's go one by one through the problems of this 2026 technical regulation that is causing so many complaints. I would dare to say that the biggest thing affected by this technical regulation has been the qualifying sessions, as we know them, because the qualifying test. In essence, it has always been about pushing the cars to the limit to try to beat the clock and with that, secure a good position on the grid for the start of a Grand Prix. And in the time trials, the driver's role, his talent, and the way he approached the corners, apexes, and braking zones were what usually made the difference and sometimes led to surprising results. These technical regulations mean anyone pushing the car, seeking alternative lines, or braking harder is pushing the car further to its limits. In a fast corner, or any other attempt that a driver would normally make in a bid for a fast lap, it ends up being counterproductive. So they are limited to simply driving the car according to the energy plan set for qualifying, and this frustrates most drivers who feel it's counterintuitive not to push the cars to the limit in one of these sessions. Charles Leclerc, one of the fastest drivers currently in the category, has been very critical of this, as he has commented several times that every time he tries something different, he ends up running out of energy on a straight. And with that, he loses any chance of fighting for a better qualifying result. This has caused the driver's role to become completely secondary in the qualifying session and has made it entirely predictable and monotonous. Most of the time, you know who will be eliminated in Q1 and you mostly know what the results of the top teams will be based on their performance. Siendo en muchas ocasiones, the driver is merely a spectator who can't do anything to try to improve his lap except follow the energy plan set by his engineer from the start of the session. But obviously the race has these same problems, and that's because overtaking depends a lot on energy and the battery. Normally, in an overtaking maneuver, there always have to be 3 elements: the talent of a driver to know how to put the car in a place where it might be difficult to overtake, intelligence to know how and when to make a move, and bravery to have the courage to put the car where maybe others wouldn't. This was the essence of an overtaking maneuver, and it's true that we lost a big part of that with the introduction of drag reduction system in 2011. But these technical regulations make elements like bravery or talent not matter in the slightest. Instead, overtaking and battling end up being a high-speed chess game of how and when to use the battery, which is something that neither the drivers nor the fans are completely happy with. This element has caused a yo-yo dynamic in many of the races and overtakes, which has characterized the first competitions of the year, where a driver overtakes but on the next straight, after having used more energy, ends up being exposed. A counter-attack against a rival driver who has energy against the opponent who just spent it. That's why this dynamic happens. A driver overtakes, but on the next straight, the driver who just made the move ends up being overtaken. That's why, as I told you, this has turned overtaking maneuvers into a strategic duel when it comes to planning the battle, but even the drivers themselves don't fully understand it. Many times, they've reported that they've ended up overtaking almost by accident because the driver in front ran out of battery, while the driver in front has no idea why they ran out of battery. This makes the driver's criticism go in the same direction. Formula 1 has become too artificial in the way overtaking is done. Because yes, there is boost and overtake to use more energy, which can leave you exposed to a counter-attack from your rival, but if it's because of the software itself that drivers run out of energy, they are practically left exposed without being able to make the slightest attempt to defend themselves. But in fact, another major criticism that drivers currently have is that these technical regulations kill fast corner circuits, since they require points where the battery has to be charged in order to be deployed later on a straight. The fast corner sections of the circuits end up being used as energy recovery points, which means that the drivers can't push to the limit. The cars go much slower through the corners, and as a result, other elements don't really come into play, like tire wear, which has been practically minimal this season, or that the drivers take different lines to help gain time against their rivals. The drivers have been very critical of these technical regulations when it comes to fast corners. Most criticism comes from this: the harder you push the car to the limit, the more you lose at crucial points, like on a straight. And for drivers like Verstappen, Norris, Leclerc, Alonso, Sainz, and several others, this makes them feel that it's counterintuitive and goes against the true essence of motorsport, since this technical regulation basically means you have to manage everything all the time. And that's where this technical regulation fails in most people's opinion, because there's just too much management that has to be held back. During a qualifying lap or during a race, which is something that most fans and drivers don't completely like 100%. Things like having to use super clipping in the middle of a straight to charge the battery, or having to turn slowly in a fast corner, which used to be decisive points to shave tenths off the clock. The excessive dependence on batteries to make overtakes, or that when two drivers are balanced in terms of energy, overtaking becomes practically impossible. All of this happens because the battery doesn't have enough capacity to prevent these practices, but also because energy recovery is limited exclusively to the motor generator unit, kinetic. And the ways to charge the battery currently are through braking or super clipping, but it's even limited because with the current system, only the rear axle and through super clipping can the battery be charged. Since these Formula 1 cars don't regenerate energy through the front axle, they have less capacity to regenerate efficiently. The battery doesn't have enough capacity to maintain the charge without running out halfway down a long straight. So, having laid out the main problems that this technical regulation seems to have, let's move on to the last question of this analysis. Does all of this have a solution, or is this the Formula 1 will have to put up with for all these years? At this point, the top category of motorsport is working on small solutions to some of the problems with the current technical regulations, changes mainly motivated by concerns about safety following the accident of Oliver Burman at the Japanese Grand Prix. But to begin with, let's get out of our heads the things that definitely won't happen as a short-term solution, and one of them is that we won't see the V8 engines again, not this season, not next season, not even in 2028. An engine technical regulation is extremely complex. Manufacturers require several years to develop their power units, and trying to install V8 engines in the middle of a season directly in 2027 is practically impossible. There needs to be a minimum of 3 years of development for teams to be able to put new power units on the track, which is why it becomes practically impossible for us to see them in 2026, 2027 and 2028. The appearance of naturally aspirated V8 engines as we knew them before the hybrid era would also require the approval of the majority of the teams, and I highly doubt that everyone could agree to make this happen as soon as possible. It's also impossible to install last year's power units in these cars, since the 2026 vehicles were designed around these new power units, so it's impossible to just take last year's engines and simply put them in those vehicles just like that. Also, a change like this again would require most manufacturers to agree to make this change. And getting 5 manufacturers to agree to go back to last year's power units, considering that Audi doesn't even have last year's engines, is practically impossible. Now, many people are asking, why not change the power ratio to 70-30 or something similar that would drastically improve the situation? And the thing is, this is also impossible in the short term, because a change like that would require structural changes in the power units, which is practically impossible to develop in the short term. We're back to a situation where such a change would need most chemists, engineers, and manufacturing teams to agree, and convincing Mercedes to give up their advantage or Audi and Honda to switch engines would be tough. It's possible to see a change in the power ratio, but this would be more likely for 2027 or 2028. Que poder ver algo así en este 2026. But the good thing about all this is that possible changes to the engines are already being considered for the future, and there's talk that Formula 1 could return to turbo V8s this time with sustainable fuels and without hybrid elements. But these changes would take time, and no substantial ones are expected until 2030 or 2031. But then, what do we do with Formula 1 in 2026? Well, as I told you, some changes are already being discussed for the upcoming season during this spring break, but you have to understand that most of these changes will simply be patches, because any substantial change will require time, which is impossible to implement in 2026. But the changes being considered for this season would be the following. First, increase the power of super clipping. I know this sounds silly, but there is logic behind it. Currently, drivers are limited to 250 kilowatts of power when using superclipping. If this limit is increased to 350 kilowatts, the cars would have more power to recharge the battery this way, and therefore they would need much less straight track to achieve the purpose of charging the batteries through this method. So, for example, previously, with a 250 kilowatt charge, it took half a straight using superclipping to charge the battery. Now, only a part of that will be needed to achieve the purpose, but this would obviously benefit those who have a better electric power system or a better motor generator unit. Kinetic. The other solution being proposed is to reduce the energy deployment, which is currently 350 kilowatts, which would obviously cause the battery to be used less during the lap. And this would allow the cars to rely on less aggressive tactics to maintain their charge and make the battery last longer during a lap. But this obviously comes at a cost, and that's that it will make the cars significantly slower on the straights, making the cars, according to estimates, about 2 seconds slower per lap. If this solution is chosen, we might have much less management, but significantly slower cars. To try to improve qualifying, another solution being considered is to reduce the amount of energy that can be recovered. The maximum that can currently be recovered in qualifying with these power units is 9 megajoules per lap, and the idea of reducing it to 6 megajoules per lap is being considered, so that drivers reach the recharge limit faster and therefore have to rely less on superclipping. But obviously this would also make the cars slower in qualifying sessions, which might reduce lap times. But it allows the cars to be pushed closer to the limit again in qualifying. And the most exotic tactic being considered right now is to allow drivers, at their own discretion, to switch between high and low downforce modes of active aerodynamics. Currently, these modes are limited to zones designated by the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile. What they're aiming for is to let drivers open and close the wings as they see fit during qualifying. Something like what we saw in 2011 and 2012 with the drag reduction system, which had no limits on its use during qualifying sessions. The goal is to achieve greater efficiency on the straights and reduce the energy levels needed to deploy during an attempt. These are, in the short term, the changes that Formula One is considering and will be up for debate in the coming weeks. But there are also plans for changes in 2027 where a change in the power ratio is being considered, giving a year to make structural changes. This would allow for a reduction in electric power and an increase in combustion power, raising the fuel flow to a level that could be 70-30 or 60-40, it's not certain yet, but all of this will depend on the discussions the manufacturers have. Formula One is about new rules for the formula, and the goal is to simplify the rules to make the regulations easier to understand, both for the drivers and the fans, and with that, also give the spotlight back to the drivers. These are all the changes that, at least for now, are being proposed as fixes for this 2026 Formula One, but to sum it up, we've basically reached this point because it seems like the regulations were ahead of their time. The idea of the 50-50 maybe on paper was great, but once it was put on the track, with the limitations in energy recovery and the low capacity of current batteries, the estimates have fallen quite short. And it seems to be something that neither Formula One nor the International Automobile Federation had foreseen, and a regulation that was made to simplify the power units and make them more attractive for new manufacturers. Has it become the biggest headache that Formula One has had in recent years, since the category is once again overusing management, but now taken to levels never seen before? In addition to obvious safety problems that were already shown at the Japanese Grand Prix, all because of a poorly planned, poorly designed regulation with very optimistic estimates. I want to trust that everything that has happened in these 3 races will serve for the rest of this technical regulation, which I am sure with the right changes will allow us to eliminate the biggest problems that the first races of this 2026 have shown. With this, the best aspects of this technical regulation can improve, as we've seen cars follow each other more closely, and in the right conditions, battles and side-by-side corner action return. And that both attacking and defending, again under the right conditions, is quite possible. These regulations now make overtaking possible even on circuits where it was once very difficult. Like everything in life, there are good aspects and bad aspects. It's just that right now the negative aspects are the ones that mostly prevail. But if Formula One is able to find solutions after evaluating the disaster that these first 3 races have been, maybe we can see a light at the end of a tunnel that right now still looks very, very dark.